Welcome to another episode of the Mega Drew Show. This time, we're going to be taking a look at the games that used Sega's System 32 hardware. The System 32 board was released in 1990 and was the last Sega arcade hardware before the Sega Model series was introduced. One of the main reasons I chose to look at these games is that most of them never saw a home conversion, meaning the only way to experience them was in the arcade. So let's take a look at the games, starting with Radmobile. Radmobile was the first game released for the System 32 and featured some incredible graphics that demonstrated what this hardware was capable of. Behind its eye-catching presentation is a fairly simple racing game, which puts you up against other racers and the clock as you aim to reach each checkpoint. This was a game that drew me in with its visual flair. The weather conditions, changes in the time of day, and detailed locations were really impressive. Unfortunately, the gameplay doesn't match these standards, and the first-person view doesn't help, even if there is an amusing Sonic keychain hanging from the car's interior. Radmobile did receive an adaptation a few years later on the Sega Saturn, known as Gale Racer, but the reviews at the time claimed it was a big disappointment. In 1991, Rad Rally, a follow-up to Radmobile, was released, which featured a twin cabinet for two-player races. (1991) would also see the release of another racing game, this time F1 Exhaust Note. This Formula 1 racer also featured a twin cabinet, enabling two-player competitive racing. The popularity of licensed beat-em-ups was at its peak in the early 90s, and Sega snapped up the rights to make a Spider-Man game, which arrived in arcades in 1991. This was a 4-player game, similar to Konami's The Simpsons and Ninja Turtles arcade games. This was a great example of the genre, and one that worked in some platforming areas that made great use of a scaling technique that zooms in and back out of the action.
Venom has to be stopped.
(1992) saw quite a few System 32 releases, and we're going to start with Arabian Fight. This was an ambitious side-scrolling beat-em-up that used a scaling technique to make characters appear larger as they came closer to the bottom of the screen, giving the action a real sense of depth. Despite its ambitious features, Arabian Fight just isn't a great scrolling beat-em-up. It's interesting to look at, but the gameplay just brings the whole experience down. Dark Edge was a fighting game that used sprite scaling to create a 3D look and feel. Now, 3D fighting games didn't really work until Virtua Fighter came along, and even then, it took years for 3D fighters to excel. Unfortunately, Dark Edge is a very forgettable title. It controls awkwardly, looks terrible, and is best avoided. Air Rescue followed a similar formula to Sega's classic Choplifter, only this time they made use of the advanced hardware to allow 3D movement using a first-person perspective. The objective is the same as Choplifters: pilot a helicopter, destroy enemies, rescue prisoners, and return them to base. Air Rescue was adapted for the Sega Master System, but retained the 2D style of Choplifter due to the hardware limitations. Stadium Cross was an impressive dirt bike racing game that utilised a twin cabinet for two-player races. Now we've come to perhaps the most highly regarded game released for the System 32, or the most talked about anyway, and there's good reason for this. Golden Axe Revenge of Death Adder was the arcade sequel to the original Golden Axe, and although I still prefer the original, technically this game was a huge leap forward. Death Adder is back and out to take revenge, and it's up to our 4 new heroes and Gilius Thunderhead to fight through the hordes of enemies and defeat the axe-wielding villain. It's a very impressive entry in the beat-em-up genre that unfortunately wasn't ported to any home system at the time, much to the disappointment of fans. There is an arcade 1-up version in the works, so finally it'll give people the opportunity to purchase it for home use after all these years. Holosseum was a fighting game that ran exclusively on the hologram cabinet. This was a special machine originally developed for Sega's Time Traveler. It's a game I remember seeing in magazine articles, but unfortunately never had the chance to play, and it's one of those titles you would definitely need to experience playing on an original cabinet. Title Fight was a twin cabinet boxing game, with punches thrown by using dual control sticks. The graphics were bold and well detailed, and playing from the perspective of your boxer with only an outline on the screen did a good job of immersing you in the fight. For the true experience, it's another one of those games you'd need to play on its dedicated cabinets. Being part of the OutRun series, you'd expect great things from OutRunners, and it doesn't disappoint. Graphically, the game is very impressive, with a superb use of scaling and some awesome looking backgrounds. There are lots of different cars to choose from, and the branching paths provide plenty of replay value. This was the first OutRun game that featured multiplayer, with an option to link up multiple cabinets for more players. A home port of OutRunners was released for the Sega Mega Drive, but unfortunately a lot of cutbacks had to be made. In a genre dominated by Capcom and SNK, it would be easy to forget this mediocre attempt at a one-on-one fighting game. Burning Rivals doesn't have a great deal going for it, mainly due to the slow and unresponsive controls. The only feature that stands out is its graphical style, but that wasn't really enough to hold my attention for long. Sonic didn't appear often in arcade games, but in 1993, Sega Sonic the Hedgehog was released, an isometric platformer with a trackball controller. Sonic, Ray the Flying Squirrel, and Mighty the Armadillo have been captured and held prisoner. Your task is to break free and escape Dr. Eggman's island. Alien 3: The Gun was a light gun rail shooter that loosely followed the plot of the film. Sega did a great job of capturing the atmosphere of the source material, with plenty of recognisable enemies and heavy weapons to deal with them. As far as rail shooters go, this is a great example, and one that's definitely worth checking out if you ever see a cabinet. F1 Superlap was a fully licensed Formula 1 game that was the follow-up to 1991's F1 Exhaust Note. I was expecting more from a Jurassic Park rail shooter, but unfortunately this 1994 release really failed to deliver. The mix of 2D and 3D graphics tend to look messy at times, and because the cabinet used joysticks instead of gun controllers, I never really felt immersed in the game. Dragon Ball Virtual Reality Versus, or VR/VS, was a fighting game played from a third-person perspective. The original cabinet featured standard joystick and button controls, and resources say that there was a deluxe version that featured motion controls. The graphics are impressive, but at times things can become a bit confusing due to the position of the characters on the screen. Hard Dunk was a street basketball game that was released in 1994. Games consist of 3-on-3 matchups, with the winner being the first to score 11. It's another game that tried new things, but ultimately its ambition is what let it down. The camera angle can cause confusion, especially when there is a crowd underneath the basket, and it's even difficult to see who has the ball at times. For arcade basketball, better stick to NBA Jam. Super Visual Football was an arcade simulation of the beautiful game, played from a 3D perspective. The viewing angle reminded me a lot of Super Soccer on the Super Nintendo, and although I prefer a side-on view when playing arcade football games, I did enjoy this one. Slipstream was the last known game to be released on the System 32 hardware, and was developed by Capcom in 1995. This Formula 1 game was produced in limited quantities, and like many of the games in this video, it never saw a home release. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember to let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, and subscribe to the channel for future content.